My name is Khalil.
Admittedly.
Welcome everyone to the fifth week of the Rugby Research and Injury Prevention Group Summer Lecture Series. I'm happy to welcome Dr. Lopez, Professor Simon Roberts, our affiliates, and anyone joining us on our conference call. So today I'd like to start with our featured key presenter, Professor Simon Roberts, a research associate at the University of Bath and also a member of the World Rugby Science Network. Professor Roberts will be presenting on the Community Rugby Injury Surveillance Project, results and reflections of 11 seasons of data collected in the English men's game. Professor Roberts, would you like to share your screen?
Okay.
Okay.
Does that, can everyone see that screen now? Before I start, I'd just like to check.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Okay, that's excellent. Would you like me to start then?
Yes, please.
Okay. Well, first of all, thanks for having me back. I think I've spoken to the group a few times now at this sort of time of year. So it's always a really nice time to catch up annually when we don't get to go to international conferences. And I don't believe I've spoken for at least a couple of years on the core of the work that I do, which is the Men's Community Rugby Injury Surveillance Project in England. So we've been doing this for 11 seasons now, and I think it's a good time to reflect on that data we've collected. Certainly, obviously, with the English season in 2019-20 was shortened or didn't actually start in any meaningful way. So this gave us time to just sit down and take a look at this data. So that's what I'd like to present to you this evening. So just to start, just to introduce our group, we are hopefully becoming an official centre at the University of Bath in the UK. So it's the Centre of Health, Illness and Injury Prevention in Sports. We're just starting that off. And just a quick photo and acknowledgement to the group that I work with. Obviously, you can tell by the date, this was in pre-COVID times, a few years ago now at the IOC conference in Monaco. That's why we all look so happy. But the core of that group is still with us or working at other associated institutions or governing bodies. So we've got a good spread of knowledge now across different organisations. So just a little bit of a background, firstly where we're based. So if people aren't sure about some of the geography of where we're from, we're University of Bath, and Bath is in the southwest of England, sort of hour and a half from London. It's a beautiful Georgian city known for its Roman baths, and it's a rugby hotbed. So in the bottom right corner down there is the Bath Recreation Ground, which is the official ground, and it's quite unique in that it's right embedded right in the city, and a lot of supporters like that. So I do urge you, if you're ever in the UK, to pop down and visit Bath. It's a really beautiful place to be. Ironically, our university was built in the 1960s, and it's not that beautiful. But one of the caveats when it was built is that you couldn't see it from the city centre. So it's high up on the hill, and it's a little bit hidden, but it does have some great views over the city as well. So I thought I'd just let you know a little bit about that. So our injury prevention group that we work with, that I introduced you to just now, we actually we started working mainly in rugby union. For obvious reasons with the injury situation as it is. But we also branched out to a number of other sports now. We do injury surveillance and prevention in cricket, soccer, where we're mainly looking at growth and maturation in the youth population, horse racing, and gymnastics. But I'm going to focus mainly on rugby union. That's where the core of our research is. So the projects we currently run in rugby union, we have the men's premiership, and that's run since 2002, and we've collated now over 15,000 injuries on that. The men's championship, which is the next level down, it's still a professional level, but the next tier down in England, and we've only been doing that for a few seasons, so that's still in its infancy. The men's Bucks Super, so Bucks is British University and colleges, so it's a university sport, and I presented some information on that to the group previously. So we have that for the seasons that league has been running for the last 3. Men's community, which I'll focus on now, that's been going since 2009. And we have schools where we've had some kind of breaks, but we're trying to look for a more sustained data collection in our under 13, 15 and 18 schools groups. Obviously, that's a really, really important group to understand injury risk and where we can prevent injuries. So that's just an overview of the projects we're running. Obviously, there I haven't shown some of the women's projects we run. Again, they're in their infancy. We're trying to expand those. So we have those in England Rugby and the Women's Premiership over here, but we'd like to certainly investigate more at girls' school level, where there's some rugby played, and university and community. And because we have these projects all running concurrently, we're able to plot, the injury risk, the incidence of injuries over these different projects. And we have what is commonly referred to in the literature is this, the higher injury incidence for the higher levels of play. This graph here just shows the greater than 8-day injuries, because that's where I can add in the community men. We don't do 24-hour time loss for community men. So as I mentioned before, this is where I'll focus the rest of the talk on. So men's community rugby in England. Well, the teams that are eligible for the project which I run, we have about 850 clubs. There's actually a few more than that. There's probably upwards of 900 clubs across England. And if we're conservative, we'll say there's 2 men's teams per club. Quite often there's 3 teams and a veterans teams, but if we're being conservative, we'll say 2. And that gives us around at least 30,000 players playing at a good standard every week. If we compare that to the number of players that play professional rugby, where those are in the hundreds. So my argument always is, well, we know a lot about professional rugby injuries, but actually there's a lot more players playing community rugby each week, and therefore, we really should understand the risk that those players are exposed to. And we are in England the world's largest playing population of adult amateur players. So with this in mind, the inception of the Community Injury Surveillance Project, it started in 2009. Before this, we had really no understanding of what the risk was in the men's community game. As I mentioned, the professional surveillance project for obviously professional players have been running since 2002, so we had a good understanding of that. But obviously the risk is going to be different in the men's amateur game, where the players train a lot less and the standard of play is a lot lower, and therefore we'd expect the injury risk to be different. So participating clubs are recruited. We recruit them each summer from that pool of around about 850. And crucially in this project, participation is completely voluntary. So we approach the clubs and they say whether they'd like to take part. Once teams are recruited, the data is collected by the team's therapist, or physiotherapist, or doctor. We ask for a minimum of a sports therapist. And that's kind of equivalent, not dissimilar to an athletic trainer, I guess, in the US. And they report data using an online collection platform or paper forms. We started with paper, we moved to an online collection platform. Which is now used a lot more. There's some who still insist on the paper forms, and I just about let them because they've been in the project for a while or for whatever reason. So the information they report to us, we keep it very simple. We want information on their squad, so the name of the players, their mass, height, date of birth, keeping those details very brief. And then we need to know their match exposure per team. So we ask them to log every time that team plays in the season. These teams play around about 25 to 30 times a season. And the details are very brief, such as the score, the weather, pitch surface, and very basic details. And then, of course, the important part is we collect information on time loss injuries. So our definition, as I mentioned before, is any match play injury. We don't collect training for this population, again, to keep things simple and to keep the burden down on these volunteers who return the information. So any match play injury resulting in an absence of 8 days or greater. Again, that 8 days is to reduce the burden. If we ask for 24-hour time loss injuries, that would be a lot more challenging at these clubs because players may not see their therapist after the match on a Saturday until a Tuesday. Then it becomes very difficult to reliably report 1 or 2 day injuries after that. And also it's more difficult for the therapist to understand when the player is fit to play. And so we ask for details such as the number of days lost to their return to play, the injury event, so was it a ruck, a maul, tackle, and the injury diagnosis, and the timing, so which match quarter, and obviously we know which season and month and when it happened in the season. So the whole gist of this data collection for these clubs is that we keep things simple because the people reporting it don't have to, and they're not with the club often more than 2 or 3 days a week. So I'd just like to run you through what we've done over those 11 seasons in the project. So as we can see on the left-hand side here, we have the seasons going down. The core of the project is collecting those time loss injuries every season. So that's the main strand that runs through the project. In the first 3 seasons, we also asked teams to log medical attention injuries, defined as any injury when the therapist, the sports therapist or the physio, went on the pitch for a medical reason. And we logged that and we've written that up. But we just did 3 seasons of that. And I also tried using some self-report from the players using SMS messaging. That was to complement another project, and obviously that was a very simple data collection, but it was really just to explore how well players would respond to self-reporting their own injuries. Obviously, the diagnoses on that was kept very, very simple, as was most of the information. But that was accessible, and we're still looking at some of the information on that. And then along with collecting injury information over those seasons, we always have additional projects running. So we ran a project looking at functional movement screen and the risk on injury. And then in the following seasons, we ran studies looking at the effect of an injury prevention warm-up on injury risk. We started with a pilot 2014-15. 2015-16, we did a full randomized control trial involving 80 teams. And we found a really positive effect of that, that training and pre-match injury prevention warm-up. I'm not going to talk about that today. That constitutes a whole other talk. And then the following season, because the RCT was successful, we've now created a resource called Activate, and that's now been distributed and it's freely available on all the England Rugby websites. And so teams can now access that. So that's considered rolled out. We still have to understand whether that's having an effect on injuries across the board, but that's something else to monitor. And there was also an impetus from the Rugby Football Union, the England governing body, to increase the number of artificial grass pitches over the last 3 seasons. So there's now 28 clubs who have an RFU sanctioned pitch at their club. Those teams are all now involved in the injury surveillance data reporting. Actually, when I say this project is voluntary, those teams with artificial grass pitches are mandated to take part. Obviously, that 28 teams is a fairly small number, so we do need data off them. So now we can assess the risk on grass against artificial grass pitches. So that's just an overview of the sort of the projects we've been running in this larger project. Today, I'm just going to focus on those time loss injuries. So the overall numbers, over 11 seasons, we've had 291 different clubs that have been involved. And we average about 59 teams per season who report injuries. We start with a lot higher number than that, but there's always 20 to 30% dropout in this project for some of the reasons I've mentioned before about it being voluntary and less access to the teams. That 291 teams, obviously, in terms of club seasons, 11 times 59 would be a lot more. And some clubs have been involved for more than one season. And I'm very grateful to those clubs because they do offer some additional information, which I'm going to try and present at the end and say why that's useful. And so over that time, we've collected nearly 15,000 team games, so they've been monitored for injuries. And out of those team games, 5,874 match injuries have been reported. So let's take a look at the overall incidence. So you're going to see a few of these graphs where we have incidence on the vertical axis. So we always present per, excuse me, per 1,000 player match hours. Excuse me, just going to take a drink. So that incidence will appear on the vertical axis, and then obviously we go through the seasons on the horizontal axis. If we look at the top graph, that shows the incidence over time by different playing levels. So I haven't introduced those playing levels to you, but within this community cohort, we have levels 3 to 9. Levels 3 and 4 we considered the highest level of community rugby, so that's quite a high standard. Some of the players are semi-professional, but they still fall under that community banner. Levels 5 and 6 we say still amateur, but more aspiring clubs. And levels 7, 8, and 9 we consider more recreational. You know, they don't train as much. So those are just how we've grouped those playing levels into 3 distinct groups. And there we have the incidence over time by those playing levels. Obviously, because the number of teams is a lot smaller in levels 3 and 4. There's only 48 teams in total in those leagues, and we only have about in the teens of those participating. And that's why there's some variation in that data. But we can see that trend for higher incidence of injuries. And then the amalgamated data, so all levels combined, is in the figure below. So I've just put my laser on, I hope people can see that. So we have the blue line here is the incidence over those 11 seasons. And we can see here an increase in the incidence over that time. I thought I'd just add in that incident that in 2015-16 is when we introduced the Activate warm-up, and that might explain that slight halt in that increase in that season, because in that time about a third of those teams would have been doing Activate from the randomized control trial. So that might have possibly brought the incidence down. But yeah, generally speaking, we're seeing that increase. So what does this mean in real terms? Well, I'm speaking to people who probably understand, you know, incidence and why we present like that. But what's actually the risk of that increase? Well, early on in the project, we would have been talking about 1 injury every 3 games, team games. So for every team, 1 injury in every 3 of their games. And that's sort of increased over those 11 seasons to 1 injury in every 2 team games. So I think that's a meaningful increase, and we're talking about a significant increase here. The severity actually appears to have reduced a little bit, and we're not sure why that is. And it's still wait to see in future seasons if that's going to continue going downwards. I suspect it might even itself out. But that's an encouraging trend that the severity, the mean days absence per injury, appears to be lower. So if we come back to this overall increase in incidence, why is this apparent increase in injury incidence? And it's very difficult to identify exactly why this is occurring, because, you know, we just receive injury information, we don't get a lot more. But there's some ways to explore this. Firstly, is there a particular type of injury that's increased in incidence that's really pushing up that average? Have reporting practices changed in clubs? We can't rule that out. There's no real reason why, but we need to maybe explore that. And, you know, over those 11 seasons, has the community game in England become more demanding? Has the coaching improved? We often see this trickle-down effect where practices have improved at professional clubs, and they trickle down to community clubs. They're not just left at those professional teams. And then combined with that, are players better physically prepared? So are they able to, increase their work rate throughout a match and thus increase their potential for injury risk? There's always the question of, when players physically more conditioned, will that protect them against injuries, or will that extra conditioning mean that they can actually produce more work throughout the match and expose themselves to more risk? There's always that balance on that question, but it's something we can think about. So coming back to this question of, is there a type of injury which is increased? Well, the clue is in the top banner of this slide. So if we take a look at the injury incidence for concussion over this period, we can see that there's been quite a sizable increase in that. I should also say, this type of increase in incidence has been seen across other projects. Certainly, there's the same kind of slope in the professional rugby projects, although the incidence of concussion is a lot higher. The rate of change looks fairly similar. One interesting aspect to consider for this increase in incidence is that in 2013, the governing body for England Rugby produced their concussion education resource called Headcase. And this was a huge push to educate community school teams about concussion. And so they produced lots and lots of resources for clubs. They sent out loads of material, loads of posters went to clubs, lots of educational programs. And this really, really increased the whole knowledge in clubs towards concussion. And so that threshold of identifying concussions went down. Clubs were a lot more, players, crucially, coaches, the whole team were better able to identify concussions and make a decision to take players, remove them from the pitch and report that as concussion. So we do think along this slope that there has been basically better reporting over this time, better awareness, and actually that's paradoxically, looking at this slope, it's actually quite a good thing because it shows that we're identifying more and there's better awareness. Obviously, again, just based on this information, we can't rule out that actually there is an increased risk in the game itself. So that concussion, staying on this subject, accounts for about 40% of that overall increase. So for all injuries, there's approximately, based on the slope of that increase, is about an instance of a change of increase of 1 incidence per every season. So the red line on this figure is that overall incidence that I showed in previous slides. The blue line is when we remove concussions from the overall number of injuries. And we can see that if we take that into account, it does flatten the line somewhat by approximately over the course about 40%. So we can show here that concussion does have quite a contribution to that overall injury risk. If we look at this by other body regions, so grouped into the head, neck, the upper limb, trunk, and lower limb, we can see that the lower limb is increased slightly. Coming down to the very bottom here, the trunk, the yellow line, there really hasn't been much change in that, but the incidence is generally quite low. And then in the upper limb, there's been a small increase in the incidence of injuries. So when we're talking about the upper limb, it's mainly shoulder, if I'm honest, and some hand and wrist injuries. But then the green line shows the head, neck, and obviously this is largely driven by that increase in concussion. But when we split this down into the body regions, that head, neck still is the region that's contributing most to that increase. So if we look at some diagnoses here, I do have only the data for the last 5 seasons, 2015-16 to 2019-20. And here we've got the injuries split up into more specific diagnoses. And we can see that obviously concussion has risen to the top and is probably going to stay at the top in terms of the diagnosis with the highest incidence. But thereafter, there's no particular patterns in terms of the type of injuries. We get the same kind of top 5 most seasons, so knee, joint type ligament injuries. These aren't split in down to specific type injuries. These are quite generalized, so knee, joint ligament, same with the ankle and shoulder. Thigh muscle strains are mostly hamstring. And we can see that top 5 figure most seasons, and they sort of jostle for different positions amongst those seasons below concussion, but there's no clear trend as to which ones come next. So taking a look at the event, and this is just something I've only recently started exploring. So I've plotted the events with the highest injury incidence. So I've just picked out the player being tackled, the player tackling, player running. Collision, I've grouped accidental and intentional collisions. And obviously the ruck is the next highest incidence. So I've just concentrated on them here. And I know it's not easy to make out from here, but apart from the 2 tackling categories, there isn't a great deal of difference in the incidence of injuries for running, for collisions, or in the ruck. So again, this increase is mainly driven by increases in the tackle. So just to make that a little bit clearer, I've just grayed out running, collision, and ruck. We just look at both tackling categories. And I know there's a little bit of interaction between them, but there's a general increase, and these account for about 0.4 injuries increase every season. The tackling overall is consistently around about 50% of all injuries, and in concussion it's about 80%. So that makes sense that the tackle increasing in incidence alongside that increase in concussion. That's not surprising because so many concussions are in the tackle. So moving on to club reporting. So can we account anything for, can we see anything behind club reporting for this increase? So what I did, and this is only something I've recently explored doing, as I mentioned before, a number of teams contribute more than one season to the project. So what I did was I found 21 teams that had contributed at least 4 seasons of data collection. And the criteria for those teams was they had to have contributed data before 2015-16 and post 2015-16. I chose that cutoff because that seems to be the kind of date whereby we started seeing the higher increase in incidence. So the idea behind this was that the same clubs were reporting data across those 2 time strands, and we can still see that increase across the duration of the project. I whittled this further down, and I found 8 teams that had been in the project over the seasons that had contributed at least 6 seasons. So I looked at, and these teams had to have contributed at least 3 seasons with 2015-16 and at least 3 seasons post 2015-16. And we still tend to see that increase, which isn't dissimilar to that overall increase. So there are limitations in this approach. I need to step back and have a think about how to use this a little bit better. But it was the best chance I had of trying to see if the same teams were still seeing an increase, within those teams. Now there is the caveat, of course, that these teams will have over the 11 seasons will have changed some of their playing personnel. That's very likely, and also the reporting personnel at these clubs might have changed. I know that a lot of them have stayed the same, which is really good. But it's just the next best way of understanding if club reporting has changed. The other thing to mention here is that we did introduce our online reporting form halfway through the project. There's no reason why that should have changed practice, but we can't rule out. Instructions were exactly the same, and the teams involved in this project, that I'm showing you the data for here, also changed then as well. So it's a difficult one to pull apart, but we have to factor it in. So coming on to the question then, has the game changed over the 11 seasons? Well, anecdotally, yes, but we need some evidence. So I have chatted to therapists at the clubs and some coaches, but only on a very informal basis. And a lot of them have said that, yeah, the game is getting more advanced, it's getting more difficult. But there is a way we can possibly look at this. We can look at the number of contact events there are per match. So in 2009-10, right at the start of the project, I actually coded how many contact events there were during a match. So we did basic counts for tackles, scrums, rucks, mauls, lineouts. And in 2019-20, I've also collected footage for 45 games, which I can do exactly the same analysis for. Fortunately, I was the one who coded those matches in 2009-10, so I can still oversee that coding 10 years later. So that's quite an exciting thing to do. Of course, we have the data for 2009-10, and we're just collating the data at the moment. So I have nothing categorical to report, unfortunately, at the moment. But when we do, we can see whether the number of events has changed over that time. Of course, this is just a snapshot 10 years apart, so it doesn't tell us what happened in between, but it's another best way of doing it. So of course, if the events in the, per match were the same in 2019-20, then we can sort of discern from that actually if the incidence of injuries increased, but the number of contact events in a match are the same, then the risk per contact event is greater. So something's happening in those events. Of course, if there's more events per match in 2019-20 than there was 10 years ago, then actually that risk per event might be similar. There just happens to be more events, so there's greater exposure to injury risk for those. So I'm quite excited about pulling that data together, but unfortunately, we're not quite there yet. And then, has player physical preparation improved? Again, anecdotally, players are now better prepared, but we can't say that with any evidence behind it. Unfortunately, we don't collect physical fitness characteristics of the players over this time. There's some data to explore with height and mass characteristics. They don't tell the full story, but that's something I might be able to delve a little bit more into. So I did entitle this talk that it was going to be on results and reflections over the 11 seasons of this project. So I thought I'd just finish off with some of those reflections and some things I've learned about doing this sort of project. Firstly, we're proud that the PRIS project is the longest running community rugby injury surveillance project. I'm quite careful with those words because I put community and rugby in, and I know there's not a huge number of projects like this running anyway. So I could say community sport project, but I'm not sure that's accurate. But yeah, no, we're very proud of how long it's run. And of course, to be able to do this, sustained funding from our governing body has been really, really important, certainly to fund my position to be able to do this. But without that, these projects take a lot of time and it doesn't happen automatically. So another thing I've learned is there's a great deal of willingness out there in clubs, but recruiting them can be very hard work. But there are some people who have participated over multiple seasons, and to them I'm very, very grateful. I have always put myself in the position and think, and it's the same when we're doing any sort of research project, is would I do this project if it was me? And hand on heart, I'm not sure if I would have done this consistently over 8 seasons like some of these teams have. So I really am thankful. And there's some amazing people out there who largely do it for the good of the game. They understand they're contributing. We give them some feedback at the end of the season based on their team's injuries against the average of others. But because it's so many teams involved, it's actually quite difficult to provide them with a lot more incentive. And so in this type of project for community-based sport, when we're looking at reasonably large numbers, we have to keep data collection requirements simple. Whenever we've tried to ask for more, it really hasn't worked. And that's for all the reasons I said I covered at the start, amateur teams, voluntary participation. And one thing I've noticed as well, you sometimes think that some of the bigger clubs, those semi-professional clubs I was talking about, might be able to cater better for the project. That's not always necessarily the case. It's really just someone at the club who's willing to take it by the scruff of the neck and say, I really buy into this. And we just need one very interested person to do that. And sometimes the larger clubs, the sports, the therapist, medical team just have a lot more to do with the players. So it's not a given that because a club's big, they'll have time and resources to contribute more. And as I mentioned at the start, we do lose about 20 to 30% of the teams that we've recruited at the beginning of the season. And I used to get really stressed about every time a team left the project. But I've learned over time, reluctantly, to get used to this. And we build this into the sample size. We know we want about 60 teams at the end of each season, which thankfully we've ended up with through a lot of hard work. But yeah, I've tried to relax now. When the team says they are unable to continue participation, I just say, that's fine, thank you for starting it, and we just leave it there, because it's a lot easier than trying to chase teams who you know are not going to end up giving you the data. So just some future directions. What are we planning for seasons 2021-22? So we have continued surveillance in place for a number of our projects across the levels that I've described before. We'd like to increase the inclusion of more women's teams across the competitions. And a main thrust of the community project, so that includes the schools, is that we'd like to monitor tackle height interventions. So in the coming year in English schools, all the age groups under 18 will have to tackle below the level of the armpit. That was actually a law already in place for the under 14 teams. They just increased that to the under 15, 16, 18 age groups now. So they're all tackling that little bit lower. So we have a natural control from previous seasons, and we can now look at the effect of that. And further plans to investigate further lowering that tackle height. It's been tried a few times and talked about quite a lot. And it's something that we know when we can try and take two heads colliding in a tackle, when we take that out of the equation, we hopefully will have a safer tackle. So that's all I was planning to talk about, but thank you very much for listening. I hope you found that useful, and I'm happy to take any questions if there are any. I'm not sure how I've run for time. I do apologize if I've gone a bit longer than planned, but I hope that's okay.
Thank you, Dr. Roberts. That was an excellent presentation. If anyone would like to ask any questions, go right ahead, or if Dr. Lopez would like to add on. I would like to ask one question, actually. How do you think the data collected over the 11 seasons has contributed to risk assessment? I know you mentioned that there were certain dips for the activate warm-ups or the head case risk assessment. Are there other projects or lessons that have come from data collection?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we haven't actually. I mean, activate was the one intervention that we were able to implement, and so that is our injury prevent. That has now become the core of injury prevention programs for community rugby. Now, looking at my day-to-day, you'd say it hasn't necessarily worked. But we don't know. Maybe injury rates were going a lot higher than that, and we've managed to curtail it. But unfortunately for Activate now, it's out in the real world, and we haven't got great monitoring of how well it's being used, and that's I have to say that it's a bit of a shame that we haven't been able to monitor that effectively. I mean, that's a really difficult task to do, is to know who's using it out there. That would take quite much more precise surveillance methods than we have. So in terms of informing other prevention programs, that's the main one. The other way we use this data is to inform clubs on the kind of medical resources they're going to need at the community level. So what should they use pitch side? What level of medical expertise should they have? How often a concussion is going to occur? So we need someone on the pitch to be able to recognise that. So that's kind of how the data's informed it. But I hope that answers the question to a degree.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Roberts.
Hi, I also have a question. Thank you for an excellent presentation and for talking to us. I imagine it's relatively late where you are. But in terms of asking the question whether players being more prepared has caused this increase in injury incidents, is that also something that you're seeing at a premiership level? Because couldn't you make the comparison that, okay, premiership players may be more prepared, and you can maybe further answer your question on whether being more prepared is not preventative, but instead increasing injuries?
Yeah, it's this. It's looking at the two sides of it. So to answer the first bit for the professional game, I'm not involved in that, so I don't know what measures are in place to understand if those players are actually physically better. There's a I was going to say misconception that professional players have got much bigger in recent years. They haven't actually got a lot bigger in recent years, but that doesn't mean they haven't got fitter or more powerful within that weight size. They're probably at a place now, the professional players, where they can't get a lot bigger. It's not really a good idea. So yeah, I don't think we've been able to associate player their physical attributes to the injury risk there. So it's something we just have to sort of speculate a little bit on. So I think your sort of follow-up to that was is a player being better physically prepared or better or having better fitness characteristics protective, or does that mean they're going to induce more injury? Yeah, it's a really good question. And we haven't got a straight answer to that, but I would say the latter. I think when players are much fitter and more powerful, they're going to be entering contact situations with a lot more force, and I think that's would create more injuries than any sort of superior musculature might protect them against. That's my thinking. Yeah.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions? I'm sorry. So thank you again, Dr. Roberts. That was a great talk. And I just realized actually Professor West is on board as well. I do think we have a colleague that may have a question for him afterwards, but let me start by saying just a phenomenal job. I know how challenging community, I guess, data collection can be. I was literally just talking with the team the other day that I said at this juncture, I'd be very, very frustrated, if I recall saying that at this point in the season, we should be attending many more events. There should be more research data collectors at the events. But again, it's a very unique time post-COVID. We can't encourage people to go out with the potential risk. And I don't know if there's an incentive financially or any incentive large enough to encourage them to do the best for the sport or the sport that they're involved with. And I think that's always the big problem. I think the paper by Sologard on compliance is always the one I refer to on that, where they discuss compliance from the team, administration, and, the players themselves. So it's a multifaceted challenge for all of us in community data collection. And I think, all you could do would be commended for the efforts you do. But I did want to ask you about the artificial grass aspects. Now they're recommending to, I guess, create more artificial turfs, fields.
Yes, so I think the artificial grass pitch, it was a legacy of the 2015 World Cup that England hosted, and they put some money aside to be able to provide these pitches to a certain number of clubs, because we don't have great weather in the UK, unless anyone didn't notice. So they basically create a much more consistent surface for people to play on, and yeah, it's and create just a more consistent game. So I think we're I think 28 clubs with those pitches now. There's other teams obviously in England who have artificial grass pitches, but I'm just talking about the ones that England Rugby installed. So there's 28 of them. So I'm not sure if that number is going to increase. There were plans to, but I'm not sure it's going to. But it's a decent number, and as long as we get consistent data from those clubs involved, it can be quite an interesting, comparison with the grass.
Question I ask of you is, did they the construct and installation follow with the World Rugby match protocols for artificial turf? Because those are quite costly. And even in New York City, with our budget, we turned that down because it's quite expensive to install one of those at that, I guess, the quality of level or expectation that World Rugby requires.
Yeah, they're not cheap, and that's the reason there were more planned and not more have been done just yet. So I mean, I don't actually know the agreement that the clubs have here with the RFU, but I think the clubs, I think there's an expectation that over here that part of that installation is that they make those pitches available to other members of the community, so outside of the club. So I don't know if there's a financial incentive there to be able to to use it for more community use. But yeah, they're not cheap to maintain as well, and actually that's something obviously we're looking really closely at, because all these pitches are quite new at the moment, but I think it's really important to monitor how well they're maintained. And at the moment I can I can say that there's no difference in the injury risk on those pitches compared to grass, based on the small amount of data we've got. But it'd be really interesting to see how that moves ahead. I think it's never helped the whole artificial grass situation when professional players sort of tweet pictures of really severe burns they've had, and everything kind of gets blown out of proportion. But in England, actually, they have a really we have 2 people in charge of the pitches at the RFU, and they're very reactive to anyone's issues on that. And quite often the reports I get back are that whenever these injuries, these really severe abrasion injuries are shown, is when the pitches haven't been maintained that well. They've been let go too dry, or for whatever reason. So yeah, it's one to keep an eye on for sure.
Yeah, we're actually looking at that right now, age as well as repair to the pitch. And we'll discuss that in the future, you and I, a little bit more further, because I think you'll probably be encountering the same that we will be once we get our data points together on it.
Sure.
Yeah, that should be very interesting. I did want to make a comment. So your levels of play, I think, are similar to our, we have qualifier, open, and social. And those fall in the same area, where our qualifiers are former national players, or potentially could be candidates, or maybe were at the training camps or at the academies. And again, those are very high level players that could easily switch back and forth to the national team or not. And or at least make it to the training camps. And they really fall into that similar quality of play. I did like your comments on the 215 through 16 data, where you noticed that the decrease or the dip maybe was the full-on activate. But again, I think you guys did a great job in the marketing of the activate and the injury prevention programs, that it could have had an impact in the 215-16 season of some capacity. That may be something you may want to ask the population, because you wonder what occurred, why it dipped, and then why it rose, then all of a sudden again. Again, it's always something very unique when you see the data set in that aspect, or were they just watching the rugby sevens prior to the Olympics?
Yeah, that 2015 dip. Yeah, I haven't really. I could look more closely at that data and see, if it was the true activate. But it's a logical conclusion based on when we did the intervention that season. So in that season, about a third of those teams would have been doing activate, and we saw, we did see a reduction in incidence in those teams compared to the others. So the other third would have been the other control aspect of activate, and then the other third weren't in the trial at all. So it's a relatively small proportion that would have been exposed to it.
And I think when you looked at the individual injury types on that, the concussion, there was an increased risk. I guess I'll have to ask you, as Dr. Cantu alludes to, that there was always probably a risk. It just wasn't as documented or well documented as we're doing now with concussions. And so therefore, it may reflect the true level of concussion within the sport, or risk within the sport.
Yeah, and I think the next few seasons and a lot of projects are going to be quite crucial in understanding if that's plateaued out. I think, and I know Stephen, I don't know if Stephen's still on the call, he might be able to correct me, but the Premiership, I think, as in the last season or two, obviously last season still happened for Premiership, but it has started to level out. It was the first time they didn't see an increase. There were some steep increases for a few seasons. And so yeah, it'd be very interesting over the next few to understand if that has now reached its sort of correct threshold.
I did notice also on the injury types, when you looked at the tackle, the conditioning, so therefore you saw muscle injuries go up, go down, and shoulder injuries go down. I guess I'd have to ask, maybe with obviously Sharif's work, Hendrick's work on the tackling, your work, maybe the community population, the trickle-down theory is actually working, where technique is actually being employed. And again, maybe the better coaching, or maybe former players that are now coaching have that understanding. And that's something that I guess we have to somehow quantitate to understand a little bit better.
Yeah, because the tackle is such a, it's the major role. It's the one we all look at in terms of injury risk. I've always said if we could get technique, for example, perfect every time, we would probably that would probably be the thing where we see we start reducing or curtailing that increase in incidence. I think it's quite challenging to introduce things like that to these sort of community teams, to guys who've been playing for a number of years and they've sort of evolved bad habits. It's probably our best option here is to introduce it really well at school youth levels and get the players there to tackle correctly. I think the problem is, as well, as as you got the levels, I don't think the players, certainly as the ages get older, I'm not sure they think about technique that much. A lot of the occasions they'll do anything they can to stop that player. And sometimes the effective techniques can be the dangerous ones. So when we see the hold tackle, sort of the smother tackle, when both players are upright, well, we know that's what induces the risk when there's two heads with the potential to clash, or the head onto a shoulder. So yeah, it's a difficult one to pick apart for sure. But yeah, if all tackling was textbook, as people were asked to do, then it would or instructed to do it would help.
No, great, thank you. Just as usual, phenomenal work, Professor Roberts and your team. And I think it just lets everyone know it can be done in community, no matter how much they tell us that community research cannot be conducted at high levels of quality. I hope that you and I are both advocates that we could say that we try our best to try to do that. But again, thank you again. And I don't know, I believe Lauren asked last week, Professor West, you there, Dr. West?
Yes, I'm here.
Hi, how are you? Well, welcome to North America and getting to sip and, thanks for joining us today. And hopefully we'll get a chance to meet each other in person, or maybe we crossed paths and Richie Ma was just talking to me too much.
Yeah, I think we briefly crossed paths at the last Monaco conference, but I was a lowly PhD student that hadn't much data to show or much to say at that point. So
don't even do it. Your work on it really is amazing, some of the work you've done. And I just wanted to actually tell you, I think Lauren asked if there was a better way. Am I correct, Lauren? Last week you were inquiring about last week's. Is there a better way to calculate training load than RPEs in the community setting? If you don't have the GPS, obviously, monitors, have you found something a little bit better that may be able to answer her question? She was very, I think, concerned that that's the best we can do.
RPE, that is.
Yes.
Yeah, so I mean, my whole PhD project was based around RPE data, and certainly the challenge that we had was that when you're dealing with clubs that have different levels of resourcing and so on, and not only different levels of resourcing, but even if some clubs do have GPS units, the likelihood is they won't be using the same type of units. They won't be using the same thresholds for collection methods. They won't be using the same definitions for things like high-speed running. And therefore, the reason we went with RPE was just because RPE and session RPE is the same no matter where you do it. And it's easy, it's feasible. If we do it here in Canada, you guys do it in the US, Simon does it in Bath, it's still a session RPE, and there's no issues about comparing data for that reason. So while a lot of people often criticize session RPE for being too simple and too easy maybe to use, I think currently we don't have a better method of capturing that load. And I know, as I say, there's definitely limitations associated with it, but yeah, it's just one of those things that often the challenges associated with other things are going to be more difficult than potentially what you're looking at with session RP. I think it's always a good base to have, and then from there, if you can add on an external metric as well, like obviously that's your kind of internal or your proxy measure for internal load. If you can add on a supplementary external load, then it's a bonus. But at the end of the day, I think a lot of the work that we've seen has shown that that internal load is the key outcome, because that's obviously within each player. So yeah, probably hasn't helped your situation by the sense of things. You're looking for something wise inspiration as to something other than session RP, but I'm afraid I haven't got anything else.
I guess I'd have to bring up, I'm sure you saw the Robinau paper on the France team and their workload periodization.
Who was that by?
Robinau. It came out in 2020.
Don't know if I've seen that one.
The Road to Rio case study workload.
I don't think I've come across that one. You've got me
Can I
stumped.
share my screen, Jess?
You can share your screen.
That's
yeah.
not a problem, sir. We try to stay on top of things. I think Dr. Roberts knows this. So this paper just came out very uniquely. Can you see it, everyone?
Yeah, so we can see the paper.
Okay. It was reviewed by Hill. Kevin Till, not Hill. Kevin Till there at Leeds Beckett. And it was very interesting how they brought up the point of the in-season. They were talking about the in-season workload prior to the Olympics, and we were going over it, why it was very important. And I think I explained, I said it's very, very difficult to try to reach the workload expectations of an actual match, and let alone within that kind of an arena of the Olympics. And it's just very unique to talk about it. So this paper, they did a very unique analysis, but they also alluded to some very unique facts on, so they used the HSBC 7 series, right? And they were looking at the workloads up until, and so say hypothetically you're England and you're Japan, and you end up with the last 2 slots on the HSBC 7 series. You're not so fortunate because you need to be there as your home team for your fans. You can't skip out of the last 2 events and then train for the Olympics, or lick your wounds and then prepare for the Olympics, whichever way you'd like to look at it. But the point is that this paper was very unique in that they explained that the Olympic preparation phase, discussed the France team missing out on the last stop on the HSBC 7 series. They chose to voluntarily not attend, so this way they can prepare better. Now, I know the multiple implications in that, but in the big picture, I think strategically, if you look at the periodization, in this particular one with the fatigue and that, they were able to show, I think at the end of the last of the series, they showed that it was decreasing prior to, and then it increased just before the IOC. I'm sorry, before the Olympics, excuse me. Anyway, it's a very good paper. I wish it wasn't shrouded in that situation of the implications, but a very good paper nonetheless. You should take a look at it.
Yeah, it's interesting actually that you bring that up, because initially part of my PhD was going to be looking at not only the Premiership men's teams, but also the Sevens team. And because with the Sevens team, it's a smaller group, it's one group of players, it allowed us to look at not just session RP, but GPS loads, heart rate variability, daily wellness questionnaires, and so on. Just with the way things went, we never ended up actually kind of pursuing that or publishing much of the data from it. But I think just looking at what you showed there, that one graph, it's amazing how the cycles look pretty much exactly the same as what the English team would have had. Like you build up for your competition, you have a week off, you then build up again, and it's very, very cyclical. And then the only thing that we ever did really look at was around heart rate variability and changes as a result of travel, and almost as a proxy measure for performance, because in that context they find it very difficult to be able to actually do fitness testing with that group, because it's just such a, they're pretty tired as it is. To add on a whole pile of extra fitness testing is just not going to happen. So
I think strategically it was a very good move. I don't think, anyone else would have thought of that. And I think maybe even with the timing of the publication, maybe they felt that the HSBC 7 series wasn't going to go on because they did the couple things. The US did the quest for gold, prep for Tokyo. They knew that the HSBC 7 series wasn't going to go on, so I guess they found an opportunity to publish this. But again, very, very sneaky. Again, I know for a fact if LA, well, it was Vegas before, but if LA, right, or London, or Hong Kong ended up at one of those last spots, I know for a fact, Fiji would never miss Hong Kong. It's just unthought of that they would gyp their fan base, and let alone they're the reigning champs of Hong Kong Sevens. So it's a unique thing. Again, well, it was a pleasure talking with you, and I hope you enjoyed we brought up this paper to you, and we'll forward it on to you if you need be. But thank you, Professor Roberts. I know you need to get some sleep. And maybe next year we'll get you Mr. West to join us, okay? Would love to hear what you have to say on some of the training and periodization. We'll probably try to bring in the Northeast Academies, which are, I'm banging my head against because it's difficult. Their loyalty to play with their home clubs and understand that they should not sneak in a match or a tournament if they're on the track with the academy. I don't even know what to say. It's hard. You can imagine, like I said, even there we're speaking again about the loyalty to the club and fans, and it's a challenge nonetheless in the sport that we all love. Well, we'll look forward to seeing each other soon. And thank you again, Professor Roberts and Professor West. And hopefully we'll look forward to talking further with you.
Pleasure. Yeah, no, thanks for having me. And yeah, it's good to speak. And hopefully we can catch up in person, not in the not too distant future.
Certainly. Stay safe, both of you, please.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Okay.
Cheerio.
Thank you, Dr. Roberts and Dr. West.